Welcome everyone to the climate justice event discussing the role of the built environment. This is organized jointly by The Edge and Buildings and Cities. I'm Richard Lorch, the editor of Buildings and Cities and an Edge member. The Edge is a multidisciplinary UK built environment think tank. It regularly hosts debates and events to influence how the built environment could be made better. And Buildings and Cities is an international peer-reviewed open access built environment journal. In addition to publishing high-quality research, we also place an emphasis on bridging the gaps between the producers and end users of research. We do this through events such as this, commentaries, and briefings. Climate justice is not a new issue. It has been discussed for more than 20 years. However, two recent events have heightened our awareness and our focus on social injustice. The first of these, from my perspective, is COVID-19. It has shown how important it is to act strategically and act early to save lives. It has also shown social disparities. Disadvantaged people are disproportionately affected. This has resulted in higher mortality rates. And COVID has also demonstrated how economically effective it is to invest in preparation. The human and financial costs of a disaster are always much higher than the mitigation efforts. The second thing to bring to our attention is Black Lives Matter. Environmental justice cannot happen without social justice. And it's increasingly clear that climate justice is not a middle-class issue. There's an increasing recognition of how climate change will impact on minorities and disadvantaged peoples within a society. Turning to the professions, they have an important place in society. The professions have a set of responsibilities to society that fall outside the marketplace as well as inside. For the medical profession, it is summed up neatly as do no harm. For the built environment professions, we have an obligation to protect the public good. This can be interpreted as acting as stewards of the built environment, ensuring the performance of the built environment is suitable for the intended purpose, and also ensuring that the built environment provides a safe, healthy, and environmentally sound place for all. Many built environment professionals are aware of particular built environment issues. For example, fuel poverty, summer overheating in buildings, flooding, health and well-being, overcrowding, lack of open space, clean water, so on. But there is a need to reframe these within a larger and holistic agenda that is being set now by some national governments and the UN. Climate justice presents a wider framework to ask who will be disadvantaged or made vulnerable, particularly by the built environment, both now and in the future. Some of today's presentations are based on the Buildings and Cities special issue on climate justice. To our knowledge, this is the first climate justice special issue to focus on the built environment. It brings together new research and new thinking. We hope it will help to initiate a much needed wider discussion and lead to constructive actions and outcomes. Unfortunately, there isn't time to discuss all 10 articles as they bring a wealth of insights on a wealth of climate justice issues from Kenya, Poland, Germany, Australia, the US, and the UK. I encourage you to take a look later at them. They are all free to download. We're going to hear about some overarching themes that emerge from the special issue, but I just want to take a moment to summarize them now or introduce them. We won't go through all of these in the event today, but they are in the special issue. The first is government policies, for example, retrofit programs and phasing out of fossil fuels, clearly aspire to do good, but they can have negative impacts if they neglect to consider disadvantaged people. Often these policies are aimed at middle classes and don't consider other groups. The second is inequities happen at many different spatial levels between different countries, but also within a given country, city, or society. A recent report by Oxfam and the Stockholm Environmental Institutes highlights the vast differences between the wealthiest 10% of the population, who are responsible for generating the majority of greenhouse gases, and the other 90% who are or will be negatively impacted by them, particularly the lowest 50%. Professionals, a third, have the power to engage with communities as well as influence what local and national governments do. Professionals are also empowered to make things happen on the ground in terms of specific projects, and that is the main focus for today. And fourth, but not least, are local communities who have and can be a positive force for change if they are empowered and are able to have a voice. Giving disadvantaged communities funding and the ability to distribute those funds seems essential. A fascinating program in Portland, Oregon is doing just that and could be a viable model to emulate. Today, as I said, we are focusing on questions surrounding the role of professionals within a particular society or local area, with two key questions. What can professionals do about climate justice? And what can professionals change? We'll hear 4 speakers from different perspectives and then have a question and answer session. Towards the end of the session, the speakers will also have an opportunity to reflect on the conversation we had today and suggest some points for going forward. A few housekeeping rules. Please turn off your microphones. This reduces background noise and makes it easier for everyone to hear. Please do switch on your video if bandwidth allows. Please put your comments and questions in the comment panel. There's a button at the bottom of your screen for that. We will also be recording this event, so your presence and comments will be in the public domain. Michelle Wang will field questions that are in the chat to me. And I want to acknowledge and thank Michelle, along with other colleagues who are working behind the scenes to bring you this event. Andrew Schoons, Jane Wernick, Simon Foxall. And of course, my huge thanks to the authors of this special issue who provided us with new evidence and insights. Our first speaker is Anna Mavrogianni, who is an associate professor in sustainable building and urban design at University College London. Anna is particularly interested in the nexus of climate change mitigation and adaptation of the built environment, well-being, and social justice. Anna will introduce the topic of climate justice and provide some context. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Richard, very much for the introduction. So I'll try to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, many thanks for the introduction and to everyone who has joined our event today. So my name is Anna Mavrogianni. I'm based at the Bartlett at UCL, and I'm one of the co-guest editors of this special issue in the Buildings and Cities Journal on the relationship between climate justice and the built environment. I am an architect by training, and I've been carrying out research in the built environment, sustainability and well-being for more than a decade now. But in recent years, as Richard said, I've been increasingly interested in this nexus between climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and social inequalities. So what I'd like to do with this introductory presentation is to outline in very broad terms the topic of this relationship between justice and the climate justice and the built environment, and also offer an overview of the challenges that we are facing as a discipline, but as well as a society, and also the knowledge gaps that I think need addressing, and also frame some of the questions that I think we should be asking. And then my talk will then be followed by a more in-depth presentation by Sonia, my co-guest editor of the special issue, Isabel and Faye. So what are the challenges ahead? So we have there in the diagram, I think we're all familiar with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are considered kind of a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. So we can see there featuring very prominently the promotion of health and well-being, the reduction of inequalities, and all of this featuring alongside, of course, climate action. And I'd like to emphasize here that social injustice around the world is very real and present. We are currently facing an unprecedented challenge, the global COVID-19 pandemic, which on the one hand, it has shed light and exposing glaring existing structural inequalities and inequities and entrenched disadvantages, both within and across societies, as Richard mentioned earlier. But I think it's important also to note that on the other hand, it has also magnified these inequalities in an unprecedented way. And at the same time, this year, we have the powerful rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, which has again reinforced the message and increased awareness about inequalities. And one of my favorite protest slogans that I've seen was "Racism is a pandemic too." So where does climate justice fit in all of this? So climate justice will exacerbate inequities worldwide. And climate justice looks at the climate crisis that we're facing through a human rights lens. And there have been significant efforts made recently to connect those two issues that some might argue are not connected, but I think they're very, very interconnected, those two urgent agendas. And there is emphasis that climate justice is in fact social justice. For instance, in the context of the BLM movement, environmental justice is considered racial justice. Now, vulnerability to climate impacts, we know that it's unevenly distributed, and this is due to pre-existing patterns of privilege and marginalization within and across societies. We also know that low-income, socially, economically marginalized communities and individuals suffering from chronic diseases or social isolation, older, younger people will be disproportionately affected by climate change during extreme climate events, etc. And this is due to their limited ability to adapt, cope, and recover. And in addition to this, again, as Richard mentioned earlier, some of those climate change adaptation and mitigation policies and programs and initiatives, if they're not well thought through, they may actually have unintended consequences and in fact end up exacerbating vulnerabilities or create new ones for marginalized people. And I also strongly believe that as a discipline, we have a huge responsibility. I think that the built environment and all the stakeholders that design it, maintain it, study it, inhabit it, we have a really important role in exacerbating or alleviating the burdens associated with climate change mitigation and adaptation. So these were the kind of the questions that were at the back of my mind for a long time. And I feel that we should start asking, so what are those climate justice implications of the built environment? What are those complex mechanisms and feedback loops? Importantly, who is responsible, when and where? And again, this concept of responsibility And this is something that we analyze a lot in our editorial with Sonia. Perhaps she might talk about it later on as well. So the concept of responsibility, as well as the concept of boundaries, both spatial and temporal, I really think are key to explore. And also, how can the various stakeholders, the various actors in this area respond to this huge challenge? What are the solution-oriented pathways we should start exploring to address the challenges that we are facing? So this kind of thoughts is what led to the development of this special issue. So some of the research projects I was involved in the past did touch upon some of those issues. I have to say that most of my work is on mapping vulnerability to heat and pollution across UK building stocks. However, I felt that we were just touching the tip of the iceberg, and we didn't really address justice dimensions of the built environment in a sufficiently systematic way. And I also strongly felt that we really needed input from other disciplines, as well as policy and industry and communities, in order to go more in depth and unpack these very complex problems. So that was the point where I was around, I think, 3 years ago, when we initially had a chat with Richard, and we started developing that special issue. So when I suggest that topic, he very wisely, given that I didn't have any expertise in the area, he suggests inviting Sonia, who is an expert in climate justice and climate change policy design. And she really brought much needed expertise and very valuable insights during the development of the issue. So the special issue was launched back in April. Buildings and Cities is a new international peer-reviewed academic journal, and importantly, it's open access, so you can access those papers in our editorial for free by visiting the website. So we had a large number of submissions, and following the peer review process, it was nice to see that we actually achieved quite a good geographical spread across 7 countries. So I'll briefly now try to summarize some of the key findings emerging from those papers. Again, thank you very much to all the authors who contributed and contribute to this ongoing discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have the time to present every paper in detail, but these are some key messages that I think are important. So one of the emerging themes was this idea of unintended consequences of climate change mitigation policies. So for example, an example from Poland, policies aiming to reduce carbon emissions and air pollution could potentially increase fuel costs and fuel poverty for certain segments of the population in social housing. The fact that energy retrofit opportunities may not be equally distributed, as Richard said, they might only be accessible to middle-class households. The fact that we really need to move to shift from our focus from energy and carbon metrics to more community-inclusive processes, more of a human dimension. And again, the idea of adaptive capacity, that the people with limited adaptive capacity are increasingly vulnerable to climate effects. At the urban level, there was a lot of emphasis on the fact that urban decision-making and socially just planning should integrate climate justice aspects and information about human behavior. And one of my favorite takeaway messages was that building design could be a tool that promotes equity. So what next? Because I think that this special issue created quite a lot of questions, posed a lot of questions. So what next? What's next in terms of research and other initiatives? So I'll just add a few thoughts here. So again, as Richard said, I think that built environment professionals, we do have an obligation to act in the public interest. And professionals and citizens more broadly, we can begin to think and act in a proactive manner. So as individuals, professionals can potentially change, we can change our practices right now. So individuals and firms have agency to act, and we don't have to wait for regulations or standards to be implemented. And I also think that as a next step, we should also start thinking about how to implement change at different levels, so individual level, firm, institutional, policy, and so on, because the challenges are enormous and very complex. So I think the first step is to understand those interlinkages, but then start unpacking and breaking down the problem and examining at different levels. So I hope I'm still within my time slot. We'll next hear from Sonia, I think. And just to say that my ambition really for this special issue was for it to function as a primer for built environment researchers and practitioners that kind of presents what climate justice means, why it matters, and how it can be embedded within built environment research and practice. And I'm hoping that events such as this, we had a couple of other events presenting the special issue, but I really hope that this range of events will start this discussion, but also give us the tools, the vocabulary for further action in order to address those challenges in a truly integrated way. So thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to The Edge and Buildings and Cities. These are my contact details, as well as the website and Twitter account of Buildings and Cities. So if you have any questions after the event, feel free to approach me. And yeah, I believe we'll take questions after everyone's talks. So yeah, thank you for listening. I'll try to stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna. And let me introduce Sonia Klinsky, who is going to be talking about strategies for integrating climate justice into the built environment decision-making. Dr. Sonia Klinsky is an associate professor at Arizona State University's School of Sustainability. She's worked extensively on climate justice at local, national, and international scales over many years. Over to you, Sonia.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I will quickly share my screen here so we can get this going, because I know we're short on time today. So let me just quickly get this going. I'm hoping you can all see my slides now. So as Anna mentioned, Anna and I had the great pleasure of guest editing this special issue, and it was something I was really excited about. I had never really worked in the built environment, but I have worked on climate change a lot. So it was really, really lovely to have this integration. I learned so much about the built environment space from doing this. So I'm going to very quickly walk you through some of the high-level takeaways that I think are really essential for the built environment community to integrate climate justice much more significantly in this incredibly important area. So 3 main takeaways about why I think climate justice is an absolutely essential issue for the built environment community to be taking seriously. One is the centrality of the built environment as a major driver of greenhouse gas emissions, and part of this is tied to the fact that the long time frames involved in built environment decisions. Decisions about the built environment last for a really long time, and they set a whole chain of path dependencies in place that have a variety of knock-on effects. This means decisions that are being made now, depending on what country you're looking at, have implications for 50, 100, and sometimes 200 years out. This is an absolutely essential element because climate change has a very, very rapidly narrowing window for action. And I'm going to get to that in a minute. The second reason why I think the climate justice conversation is essential in the built environment conversation is because of the way in which the accumulation of privileged and disadvantaged has lodged within the built environment itself. So we can think about how patterns of accumulation of privilege and disadvantage have been built into the built environment through neighborhoods that are disadvantaged, areas that are highly advantaged. You can think about some of the most wealthy condominiums in New York, London, LA, and then juxtapose them with communities in the global south, which are barely functional and do not have access to fundamental services. The risk in the all of the built environment decisions is that it's such a powerful entry point that it can either intensify or ameliorate existing accumulation of privilege or disadvantage, which makes it an unusually powerful place and an important place in our societies to talk about justice. And the last are the potential, although not always achieved, the potential to have real well-being and built environment synergies in a low carbon context. And this again is something that's often elusive. There's often good intentions. There is the potential here, but it doesn't always happen. And this goes back to this dual capacity for built environment decisions to either make things a lot better or make things a lot worse. And this is exactly why the built environment community needs to be thinking about climate justice in this space. So I want to just quickly highlight a few elements from the climate context to put some of this in context. So the first is we think about the rapidly shifting context and the carbon budget we have available to us globally. So this comes from the IPCC, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And the reality is, if we wish to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming from pre-industrial eras, we have about 9 years of current emissions at that rate. That's a very, very tight window. The chances of turning around the kind of emission trajectories we have in that time frame is very, very short. We're looking at every single decision being made today having to be made in light of these budgets if we wish to avoid very significant climate change. This means every single building project should be thinking about this issue, because the reality is we can't revisit this in 20 or 25 years because we'll miss our opportunities to stay within a relatively limited climate change. So this is why this is both urgent and why essential for the built environment, because decision-making has such long shadows. We could easily blow right past all of these limits if we're not conscious of it. Let's also think about the existing inequalities in society. Right now, the average per capita emissions of the top 1% of the wealthy globally, and let me remind you, when you actually look at global levels, this is not that high. The top 1% globally is something around anyone who makes more than 30,000 American dollars a year, which is not that high. In fact, many people on this call probably don't think of themselves as part of the 1% of the world, but actually you are part of the 1% of the world. And the top 1% of the world, their emissions were 100 times greater than the per capita emissions of the entire bottom 50%. We're in a world in which the inequality at the global level is almost difficult to wrap your head around. Not only that, the growth in emissions of those at the top is much faster than the growth of emissions at the bottom. So if we see in this other slide, the other part of the slide, this kind of dinosaur of fossil fuels on top of this, this comes from the recent Stockholm Environment and Oxfam report. You see the share of global carbon emissions is much higher amongst the richest 5% of the planet, which means that actually we are driving inequality in the wrong direction here. And the built environment is part of this. So every time we're looking at what's being built, we have to be asking ourselves, how is this project either contributing to this accumulated inequality, or is it ameliorating this continued inequality? It's an unavoidable conversation. And as Anna already referenced to, one of the most powerful and persistent findings across all research looking at adaptation to climate impacts is that pre-existing inequalities are an absolute driver of vulnerability to climate change. And so this could be along race, gender, class, ethnicity, disability, age. These shape our vulnerability to climate impact. So the same climate impact on two different populations has a radically different impact on actual well-being. So imagine, for instance, an issue where I am is with increased storm surges and precipitation, flooded basements becomes a really big problem. Now imagine you're a family of 4, the only place you can afford to rent is a basement apartment, versus someone who has a second home, and in their basement, maybe they have an extra television and a rec room. That same flooding event, that same flooded basement, in one situation has just made a family homeless. In the other situation might have cost someone a little bit of money, but ultimately isn't that big a deal. This is exactly why pre-existing inequalities cannot be excluded from this conversation, because the same climate impact has completely different implications for the actual well-being of those people on the ground being impacted. So I really want to think about this element of the built environment, that it does have this dual potential. And for those people in the built environment professional space, this provides all of you with both an opportunity and an obligation to think through, how does this decision either increase inequality or contribute to efforts to addressing inequality systemically? And that's just why I think the built environment is such an exciting place, because these conversations have so much power in shaping how people are actually going to experience climate change. And the built environment is actually where we live, work, and play most of the time. So the question that came up then was, all right, but as a professional space, how do we build the skills into people involved in the built environment to start thinking systematically about justice? And so in our editorial, this has been developed and used by a variety of people. Geographer Nancy Fraser is really the one who has put forth this approach to justice, a three-tiered element of justice. The first is the idea of recognition, which kind of deals with how are people directly or indirectly characterized or thought of. So this becomes, who do we see as relevant? And how are we characterizing their needs, their capacities, their vulnerabilities? Procedural justice, who's involved in these decision makings and how do those processes develop, either historically or moving forward? And distribution, what are the actual kind of possible costs and benefits, and how are these distributed across society? So I want to walk us through a little bit more in depth about how you might actually use this framework when thinking through any particular built environment decision. I'll be fairly quick because I know we're short on time, but we can always come back to this. So let's think about distributive justice, since this is where a lot of us start. So imagine you're thinking of a new project, or you've been asked to evaluate a new project, or your architectural firm has been asked to consider working on a new project. Some of the things you might want to think about are there differences in distribution of a particular benefit or burden? Let's say access to green space, or on the contrary, dangers of heat in this area. How are these manifest across society? Are these connected to any other patterns? For instance, again, coming from an American context, we very, very commonly see racial disparities in terms of access to green space, access to urban cooling, access to adequate air quality, both indoor and outdoor. And so you would want to ask yourself, what is the distribution of this? And where did these disparities come from? It's unavoidable to have to deal with systemic injustices in this space and the accumulation of benefits and burdens. Procedurally, you might say, well, how actually have these decisions been made that resulted in these distributions, such that some people have access to some things and some people do not? Who was involved? This might be, you might be planning a community center. Who was involved and who should be involved? How are you going to ensure that that center actually takes the voices of those who are going to be most impacted into consideration? How are you going to deal with thinking systemically about, have in the past some actors had stronger voices, and how ought one deal with the fact that some lobby groups are stronger than others, some voices are stronger than others? How are you personally going to deal with the moral tensions that these sometimes rise, especially when you have certain clients, or especially when you're in a highly contested area? This could be a contested neighborhood. It could be an area ongoing a lot of debate around gentrification. You would want to think carefully, what are the procedural justice implications here, and what's my role in this? Recognition justice is one that's very subtle, but for any of us in the academic space, this is possibly the most powerful place for justice. Recognition justice is our imagination. How are we encapsulating the situation? Whose losses and whose benefits are we seeing, and how are we seeing them? If we're thinking about heat stress, for instance, and we're not taking into account ability, we're not able to consider the fact that certain buildings may be at much higher risk for people who are disabled, than others. And if we don't build a vision of ability into our analysis, we will miss those people and make their losses invisible. The same thing with systemic racism. If we go into a situation where we know that racism has structured that neighborhood and we exclude it from our analysis, we are effectively contributing to the accumulation of inequality here. So recognition justice shapes everything. which forms of analysis we do, which models of analysis we do, which metrics we pay attention to, why are we paying attention to the metrics we are, what form of analysis are we doing? Are we including long-term future decisions? Are we including decisions and implications outside the jurisdiction? These are really pressing issues, especially from the analytical space. Now that may all seem like quite a lot, but we also were thinking about the fact that different entities within this space may have different sort of obligations or opportunities to engage. And we kind of highlighted several key ideas in this special issue editorial that we thought were really worth more analysis and thinking. So we were thinking about the various ways that advocacy and governance could be shaped to better include climate justice. This would include a variety of strategies by which governments or other regulatory agencies could be thinking about including attention to vulnerable communities and ways of building the impacts of the built environment decisions into decision making, which includes impacts in just outside jurisdictional boundaries. So we know things like long-term life cycle analysis, where are materials coming from? Are there telecoupled, which is where you have an impact in one area having an impact in another? Are there telecoupled implications of certain ways of building? Are there long-term implications? So for instance, one of my students works a lot on insurance around sea level rise, and a wealthy community who builds a seawall actually has an immediate detrimental impact on the downside neighbors because it totally destroys their shoreline and makes them more vulnerable to storms, which is an area where a decision to protect one wealthy community actually undermines the adaptive capacity of another less wealthy community. And that could be addressed at the governance level. Documentation analysis, many aspects of this are hard to investigate right now because often we do not include the correct data. We do not generate the correct data. This includes making sure that adequate data is being collected and analysis is being done that draws attention to systemic inequalities. Are you asking the right questions about gender, race, ethnicity, ability, income, in order to track how justice is or is not being ameliorated? And the final one was really thinking through all the different actors involved in training people in this space. And that could be everything from professional associations right through to universities. Where and how are people in this space being trained on justice? And I encourage all of you to reflect on your own training. For those of you in architecture or those of you in urban planning, how many classes have you taken that explicitly tackled systemic injustice? And where and how could those be built into our training programs, all the way through professional regulations and professional certifications? So with that, I'd like to wrap up here and really thank Anna and Richard, who were definitely tight collaborators on this work. Don't hesitate to reach me, and I do encourage you to check out the special issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sonia. That was brilliant. It raised many points that we need to address, and I'm sure we'll come back to that both in the discussion in a few minutes. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Isabella Crabb, who will be talking about planning for climate justice. And let me tell you a little bit about Isabella. She's a research officer at the Royal Town Planning Institute. She holds a master's degree in urban and regional planning from Heriot-Watt University and an undergraduate degree from the University of Edinburgh in human geography. Isabella has previously worked for grassroots organizations, an environmental charity, and for the private sector in community and stakeholder engagement. Isabella, we're looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you very much, Richard. I will just try and share my screen here. Let me know when and if you can see it. Fabulous. So yes, as Richard mentioned, I'm Isabella. I work for the Royal Town Planning Institute and I'm a research officer focusing around climate change. You probably all on this call know something about the RTPI, so just to go over quickly, we are the membership organisation representing planners across the UK. We confer chartership to our members. who meets certain standards for planning. We accredit planning schools, and we also produce policy research on a range of issues relating to all sorts of matters, planning matters, including on climate change. And the principle of climate justice is key to this research. So I've been asked to speak today about what local and national government, as well as the Royal Town Planning Institute, can do to deliver climate justice, with a focus on spatial planning and the planning system. So as many of you probably know, planners are bound by various tiers of policy when making decisions, right from law to national planning policy framework, down to local and neighbourhood plans, which set out development management policies. On climate change, a key piece of legislation within planning law is written into the 2004 Planning and Compulsory Purchase Act, and it stipulates that climate adaptation and mitigation must be central to plan making, be that strategic plans or local plans. Planning does have great potential to deliver climate action, as almost everything that gets built needs to pass through the planning system. And planning also has a role in the retrofit of the existing built environment. The purpose of good planning is to manage the social, environmental, and economic trade-offs in order to deliver sustainable development. That's the kind of classic purpose of planning that you get taught when you're in a planning degree. So the potential really is there for planning to coordinate and mediate between different stakeholders and ensure that we are delivering sustainable development. And there's lots of different examples of climate adaptation and mitigation measures that urban planners are involved in. Some of them are on the screen there. So on the adaptation side, planners can find the best places to install floodwater management to protect vulnerable communities. They can integrate green infrastructure into urban design to mitigate the urban heat island effect. On the mitigation side, planners have a role in setting ambitious design standards to improve energy efficiency of homes and considering how this can also tackle fuel poverty. They have a role in increasing access to affordable public transport and encouraging sustainable settlement patterns which deliver affordable housing and mixed-use communities. So planning, there really is a potential in planning to create and protect our common assets and ensure fair access for everyone. Unfortunately, the potential of the planning system to deliver on climate justice is there, but delivery on the ground is behind where it needs to be. The interventions that I just briefly mentioned alone are not going to deliver this just transition if they take a one-size-fits-all approach. And this is where it's essential that planners and built environment professionals need to centre climate justice within their decision-making. Policies need to be tailored so that they're affordable, inclusive, safe, seek to maximise local benefit and reduce inequality. And this means considering not only how and why levels to climate vulnerability vary, but also how these interventions might benefit or disadvantage particular groups. So we published a research paper relatively recently called 5 Reasons for Climate Justice in Spatial Planning, which does what it says on the tin. So some of the 5 reasons are outlined there, which you can all read yourselves. We also, during the coronavirus pandemic, when my colleagues and I were all working from home, we published a paper called Plan the World We Need, which explores planners' contribution to a green and just recovery. And I just wanted to highlight here, Richard picked up on it in the introduction as well, that COVID-19 has really given us a stark lesson on the impact that neighbourhood inequality can have on vulnerability. As part of this Plan the World We Need research, we highlighted that Black, Asian and ethnic minorities had higher death rates and infection rates to COVID compared to their white counterparts. There was a north-south divide across the UK and also between London boroughs on death and infection rates. And that there's been suggestions that this has been linked to inequalities within the built environment, such as overcrowding due to lack of affordable housing, high levels of air pollution, lack of green spaces, which were all the result of structural inequality and institutional racism. many parallels can be made with the resilience of communities to COVID and also the risks to climate impacts, as Richard said. There are thankfully several tools emerging for built environment professionals to help their decision making and help gain access to the plethora of data, which can sometimes be very confusing on issues across mitigation and adaptation and social justice. To try and help, we have pulled together some of these into a directory of, well, it says climate tools for planners, but really I think they can be used by professionals across the built environment. It's free to use and is currently available on our website. As you can see, a number of the tools do include a climate justice element where a consideration of the social or economic vulnerability to climate impacts has also been taken into account, as well as physical vulnerability. So just pulling out one example, Climate Just tool produced by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And it's a good example which helps centre climate justice within decision making. For example, it maps where flood risk overlaps with socioeconomic disadvantage to create this kind of double vulnerability to the impacts of flooding. So you can see on the, I'm not going to say right or left because I get so confused with what way you're looking at it, but on the map, the dark red areas highlight where kind of social and economic factors, which are shown on this neighbourhood flood vulnerability index on the other side, intersect with a kind of physical risk to flooding to create the most vulnerable communities. However, as you probably also noticed, only a few of the tools included climate justice, and it's therefore essential for us as professionals to really include meaningful public engagement as a key part of the decision-making process in understanding communities and understanding their risk to climate impacts. And that can then help inform the interventions that are needed. Unfortunately, traditional consultation methods, as many of you probably know, usually promote engagement from a very specific demographic, and they're not always successful in engaging vulnerable or seldom heard groups who are also probably most likely to be some of the most vulnerable to these climate impacts. We need to start thinking about more innovative methods of engagement, such as citizens' assemblies or digital tools that can inform deliberative engagement on issues around climate change and the built environment, which take this more holistic understanding, which Sonia and Anna have been talking about, to the different aspects that make up vulnerability. So when I was actually writing my undergraduate dissertation, which wasn't that long ago, I wrote it on this tool called the Place Standard tool, which is been developed in partnership between NHS Scotland, the Scottish Government, and Architecture Scotland. And I think it's a really great example of a tool that facilitates the holistic conversations that we need to be having about the interrelated elements of place. It allows planners to speak to communities about a wide range of issues, from access to jobs and housing, the cultural vitality of a place, including affordability of amenities and access to green spaces, access to essential infrastructure like public transport, as well as the kind of softer aspects of placemaking that planners always talk about. So the sense of belonging or social identity or health and well-being. And it helps make clear the impact of the built environment on a community's ability to flourish. Currently, I think you can notice by looking at all of these different aspects, there isn't a specific climate change category, and that was actually something I picked up in my research back in 2017, that the stakeholders who were using it had cited as a kind of key issue with this tool. So there is work being done at the moment, which is very exciting, to integrate climate change as a discussion point within these different themes. And that'll help planners understand how climate change puts at risk all these different categories for who and why. For example, increasing temperatures could affect access to safe and comfortable housing and the kind of sense of safety communities feel, which is also made worse if they don't have access to outdoor leisure and green spaces. And it's also a good tool at engaging harder to reach groups. It's very portable, you know, you can take it in on printed out bits of paper or on an iPad into various communities. And I know Planning Aid Scotland did some really interesting work with it, with Gypsy and Traveller communities to gain their views. I would point out just quickly that the different topics, they're not broken down by demographics, but you could do this engagement exercise with a particular group, or you can include it as part of a wider set of engagement questions which do capture demographics. Obviously, national government has a role to play on climate change as well. So the kind of key areas that I picked out here are ensuring that within policy that climate mitigation and adaptation is given equal priority to economic growth and delivering housing. They need to commit to clear and consistent and ambitious national policy. The policy around the Future Home Standard and energy efficiency is a prime example of this. It was cancelled back in 2015 or 16 and is now being brought in again. And, you know, that's 4 years of wasted time, essentially. And also they need to resource not just the planning system, but they need to resource the built environment to deliver climate justice. I'll just show you this slide quickly here, which shows the stark cuts that have been made to planning over the past 10 years. On average, it's around 14% across, this is England focused, across England, with the worst cuts being seen in the north of England. So that's obviously a barrier to being able to plan inclusive and resilient places. So as the Royal Town Planning Institute, we are calling for a planning delivery fund of around 500 million from government over 4 years to invest in planning, focusing on these different aspects on screen here. Obviously, the Royal Town Planning Institute and Built Environment Professional Institutes have a key role to play in addressing climate justice as well. So internally, we really need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk, which the Chief Exec of the RTPI is very keen on that phrase. And earlier this year, we launched our climate action plan, for example, to take the Institute to net zero by 2025, which is one of the most ambitious targets of any of the built environment professional groups, as far as I'm aware. But in order to make sure that, you know, climate adaptation and mitigation measures and action is genuinely just, we need to continue to improve the quality and diversity of the profession. We launched our 10-year change plan on equality, diversity and inclusion at the start of the year to make the planning profession more balanced and diverse. In addition, we also have a role in ensuring that education and training through our accredited planning schools and CPD events provide planners with additional competencies to address climate justice, particularly to ensure that the voices of disadvantaged and minority groups are heard and addressed, and also to provide a platform where underrepresented communities and members can share their experiences. Our accredited planning schools do need to demonstrate learning outcomes, which include climate issues, ethics and rights, and our core CPD framework now includes climate change and environmental planning. Although I was actually just represented, oh sorry, Richard, am I going way over?
Yes, yeah, could you conclude, please?
Yes, I will. So this is a selection of our research and policy on climate and climate justice for anyone that's interested. And this is just a kind of question for the audience, which we can come back to in terms of planning reform, but I can discuss that when it comes to there. Thank you very much.
Oh, great, you're nearly there. Thank you, Isabella. It's very interesting to hear a sort of top-down view of what government can do and what institutions can do. Now we're going to look at it through a slightly different lens of middle out and a little bit of bottom up. And to talk about that is Dr. Faye Wade, who is the Deputy Theme Leader and Research Fellow at the UK Energy Research Centre's Local and Regional Energy Systems theme, and also the Associate Editor of Buildings and Cities. Faye's research explores the role of building professionals and local and national governments in creating a more sustainable environment. So over to you, Faye.
Thank you, Richard. So yes, the special issue highlights that inequities in the built environment and how different groups will be disproportionately affected by climate change due to their limited ability to adapt. So in this presentation, I'm going to explore how those working in the built environment are positioned to effectively support these groups. So I'm going to suggest that building professionals are influential middle actors, and outline some of the roles that they can play before concluding with some implications for professional identities. So the middle out perspective draws our attention to the significance of the variety of actors involved in creating, maintaining and refurbishing the built environment, and the upstream, downstream and sideways influence that these agents of change can have. So building professionals are middle actors who have the power to influence change in various directions. Upstream might include influencing policymakers. Downstream considers the way that they influence customers, while sideways could be peers and organizations with whom they work. For example, spreading the word, gaining new skills and forming new alliances. What do we know about building professionals as middle actors? So they're numerous and diverse. They include architects, tradespeople, large and small organizations, and they span the public and private sector. They're trusted messengers. So people tend to follow the advice of architects, engineers, and tradespeople. For example, what heating settings to use, what type of windows to install, or how to develop a loft conversion. Some of these people visit homes on a daily basis. So many tradespeople enter homes every day, and other building professionals learn about their clients' homes through consultation. They understand their clients' lifestyles. So they know how many people are in a household. They know their working patterns and their leisure activities. They know their decorative preferences, for example. And these groups also communicate with one another. So for example, they attend training courses and they also interact through representative bodies like GasSafe and the Federation of Master Builders. So what I want to do is just provide a few examples from the climate justice special issue to highlight some of the particular roles of middle out professionals, including the creation of trust, data collection and analysis, and co-production with local communities and facilitation at various levels. So the first example is around managing extreme temperatures, which is from Zoe Hampstead and colleagues. And in that paper, the authors focus on collaboration among different departments and levels of local government for managing risk from extreme temperatures. So these crucial middle actors address the impacts of heat and cold via emergency services, building and energy programs, and landscape ordinances. However, Hampstead and colleagues highlight challenges around the ethics, shared meanings, and aligned goals for different actors. So for example, how might the sharing of data across relevant stakeholders conflict with existing ethical and legal guidelines? And do microclimate models and visualizations create commensurate meanings across sectors such as health, transportation, energy, and social services? The authors propose a framework to support in restructuring actors' incentives, behavior, and capacities to improve policy learning and collaboration, and particularly by disrupting institutions that maintain the status quo and enhancing governance capacities which make the experiences of marginalised and vulnerable communities visible. In a second paper, which looked at low resource neighbourhoods, Ulrika Pass and colleagues explore how to identify existing and new vulnerabilities to climate change and the roles that local authorities need to play. And they particularly highlight the need to understand the dynamics of extreme heat events at the neighbourhood level, especially to identify those people who are adversely affected. So the authors here highlight that as middle actors, local authorities need to engage in the co-production of energy use data with vulnerable communities. This is essential for fostering social cohesion, increased levels of trust and empowerment between residents and civic partners. Crucially, trust between the local authority and the community provided the basis for the collection and use of detailed data to give more accurate description of conditions, which in turn helps to identify vulnerabilities at the neighbourhood level. And then a third example is around the implementation of a biomass energy system from Stephen Axon and John Morrissey. So in this paper, the authors explore how the biomass energy system was implemented in residential buildings in a socioeconomically deprived community. In this case, a housing association and their contractor made decisions that resulted in negative consequences for the community. These included changes in pricing structure, failings in public engagement prior to the installation of the system, and a lack of support for residents following implementation. And these processes resulted in negative attitudes toward biomass and exacerbated economic inequalities. So there are some clear examples from within the special issue of how professionals from both the public and private sector are acting to influence climate inequities. And just a few examples from my own research as well, highlighting the significance of this middle actor role. So this first example draws on my recent work evaluating the development of Scotland's national scale retrofitting programme, Energy Efficient Scotland. So in this, local authorities are the leads. They've been identifying priority areas for building retrofit, determining suitable heating technologies, for example, heat pumps versus district heating, and engaging building owners and occupiers to undertake retrofit. So one crucial element is the development of local heat and energy efficiency strategies, or LHEs, which are area-based strategies for energy efficiency and heat decarbonisation. And these are set to shape the prioritisation of activities over the next 20 years. So through this, local authorities are crucial decision makers who can determine which areas and individuals are prioritised for building improvements. The basis on which they make these decisions is therefore crucial in determining how support is allocated. So the quote on this slide is from a local authority officer that I spoke to, where they're talking about this opportunity to reduce carbon, but also to alleviate fuel poverty and reduce energy bills. They highlight that this is a strategic priority. I think one of the key points here is that with their responsibilities for health and social care, local authorities are already aware of supporting the most disadvantaged. A big factor in developing LHEs has been to incorporate data from the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation, which records things like income and energy poverty across Scotland. And this has helped authorities in identifying the most vulnerable communities and regions for early action to improve the built environment. I just wanted to include a second example, which comes from my PhD research, which investigated the role of heating engineers in shaping domestic energy consumption. And what's really important here is that engineers advise their customers on appropriate heating systems to install and how to use controls. And crucially, the engineer makes judgments about what is appropriate for different customers. And this may need to balance energy, but also cost and health considerations. So I think this quote from a heating engineer that I spoke with is quite insightful. They're talking about one of their customers saying, well, some people will struggle. There's no mileage blinding them with something you can clearly see they're struggling to comprehend. And this heating engineer says they'd rather have a warm resident that's not using the controls to the most economic use than one that's very, very cold and too frightened to use it. I think it's a really interesting quote for kind of highlighting this balance between energy considerations, but also the care and stewardship for individuals and simply having them warm and comfortable, and how to sort of strike that balance. So just to come towards the end of my talk, I want to draw on a special issue of Building Research and Information from nearly 10 years ago, which explored new professionalism amongst those working in the built environment. So the guest editors of that issue, Bill Bordas and Adrian Lehman, noted that the middle role of built environment professionals is undervalued. They should be imagining ways forward, testing them in practice, and developing the knowledge and capacity to apply them at scale. Professionals have a leadership role in advance of regulation. The middle role entails both practical demonstration of improved approaches and the persuasion of clients, stakeholders, and civil society of the public good that arises from these. So they argued that in order to do this, a shared professional identity should be developed. And this included the items that I've listed on this slide, amongst others. So some of the key things here are developing trusting relationships, providing follow-through, evaluating and reflecting on the performance of work, and understanding the contexts and constraints of the different work that's taking place. The professionalism that Bordas and Lehman were referring to primarily concerned the performance of buildings in use. Such calls to develop professionalism towards the delivery of zero carbon buildings have also been explored more recently. So in particular, a recent paper for Buildings and Cities from Gavin Killip suggests that competence includes theoretical knowledge, practical skill, and crucially, integrity of character. So his notion of integrity of character is drawn from the French savoir être, or to know how to be, which encompasses concepts of personal integrity, fair treatment of others, personal responsibility taking, and socially acceptable behavior. Arguably, this integrity of character could include ensuring that those in poor quality of homes, experiencing overcrowding or health issues as a result of where they live, are aware of available help, financial or otherwise, referred to the appropriate professionals, and adequately supported. I'll conclude then by suggesting that there's a need to develop professional identities and the associated integrity of character that fosters and formalizes a culture of both sustainability and equality. And just a few points for discussion that we may want to pick up on. So what impediments prevent professionals from delivering? What additional competencies do professionals need to provide co-production and facilitation for climate justice? How might we ensure all trainees are equipped with awareness of inequities and social injustices? What can individuals and their firms practically do to overcome these? And how might professionals accelerate their response to climate justice? And that's everything from me, so I'll hand back to Richard now.
Thank you very much, Faye, and thank you to all our speakers for setting out this landscape. And I thank all of you for joining in, and I hope that's been very helpful to you. If you would like to keep up with Buildings and Cities Journal, please do visit our website. There's a way to join our community, which we send out an occasional email about events like this and other news. So please do so. Please also look on the Edge Debate website for other events and outputs that they produce as well. So thank you very much to, again, our speakers for enlightening us this afternoon. I've learned a lot and I hope you have too.